Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
I'm Lindsay Calloway, a researcher with the EFC's Center for Research on Church and Faith. On this episode of Faith Trends, we're speaking with James Watson. James has extensive experience with a diverse cross-section of the church in Canada, as a researcher, as a consultant, a congregational leader, and as a trainer and coach for other leaders in Canada. Rick and I will also discuss the rich tapestry of new congregations in Canada and the future of the church. Stick around.
James Watson is with us today to talk about his new paper, New Congregations in the Canadian Kaleidoscope. James, you've worked with a combination of census data and qualitative data, which you've gathered from 30 visits to church plants and new churches in one region of southern Ontario. You did this in your role as a fellow with the Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research, housed at Wycliffe College in Toronto. Now, before we get to talk about that paper, could you tell us about the purpose of the Institute and your role as a research fellow?
So the Research Institute was initiated with a grant from the Lilly Foundation, and Dr. Steve Huco has been the director, with the intent of making information available that can be of assistance to the church in Canada. One of the major parts of that project has been the analysis of big data that's relevant to the church. One of the main projects is the Canada Revenue Agency registrations. So for 1991 to 2021, there's about 85,000 charitable registrations that are documented by Canada Revenue Agency, and that is publicly available data. But it's been a real difficulty for researchers to make use of it because the government is not asking for it as research data. They're asking for it for accountability purposes of the charities that are issuing tax receipts. Sometimes the questions have changed, which from a researcher's perspective, it means the data fields have changed. And generally, it's people who are quite busy administrators or they're volunteers who are submitting these forms to the government. And so as a self-reporting document, sometimes there are inaccuracies that just need to be accounted for in order to make the data clean enough for research to be able to readily make use of it. Of that, there's around 20 to 30,000 churches included among those charities. And so that provides a very rich source of data. But all the complications of how do you actually analyze, review, work with that large of a data set? You know, when there's about 300 fields in the report and you have 30 years of reports and 20 to 30,000 churches, what does that mean? So developing new techniques for working with the big data sets, as well as complementing that with more in-depth investigative studies on specific issues that are raised by the data. So to that end, there are 3 research fellows for 2024. I am the research fellow who's looking at how do new congregations start in Canada. And then we have Dr. Wing Wong, who is looking at the decline of congregations and what are some of the factors there. We also have Dr. Elizabeth Miller, who's investigating congregations that have upward trends. So one of the significant pieces of data that's collected by Canada Revenue Agency is the revenue of local congregations. And so those that seem to have an upward surge or have reached a new level in terms of their capacity as an organization, what's going on there? And so doing some investigation into what led to this change point in that congregation's experience.
Thank you so much for sharing. We're certainly excited by some of the work coming out of the Institute, so thank you for your role in that. Now, we like to get our terms and concepts sorted toward the beginning of our conversation as we dive into your findings. So I want to unpack how you've titled your research, New Congregations in the Canadian Kaleidoscope. 2 things stand out to me, that term congregations and that term kaleidoscope. Can you tell us why the terminology of congregation is a better reflection of the groups you encountered rather than church?
So I find when I talk to people about church or church planting, I often get the impression, okay, there's some really strong assumptions, resting behind the facial expression I'm getting when I say that word. It usually requires some unpacking. And so I do think it's wise to ask questions about the terms that we're using. Typically, when I talk to someone about church, they're thinking about established congregation, that has years of tradition and has sort of a set structure to how it functions. Whether we call that structured liturgy or whether we call that church government, there's something sort of stable and established about that. And so I'm using the term congregations intentionally because in the early years, days of formation, they don't always fit sort of a specific mold. And so to give a little bit of lenience in what we're looking at and not having sort of expectations that it'll have a very specific and established and stable format, I'm using the term congregations. And I will give some examples a little bit later on to sort of work that out.
Great. And then the other term is kaleidoscope. So you make this case for describing Canada as a kaleidoscope rather than maybe the mosaic imagery that we're used to. So why do you advocate for kaleidoscope imagery?
Well, I've been intrigued by the mosaic. That's been around Canada now for many decades and has sort of been a way of describing the multicultural vision for Canada that's been developed and that's been embraced by our immigration policies. So the idea that you bring your culture with you, and it adds to this beautiful mosaic, this beautiful mural, this image of what Canada as a society can be. But in many ways, it's a very static image. These pieces are cemented in place. They have definite edges. There's a cement-like grout that separates these different cultural identities that all make up the big picture of Canadian society. And I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of Canada. And it certainly doesn't capture some of the dynamicism that we experience as new congregations are seeking to find their place within a community and establish who it is they serve and how they operate and how they function. So with the regular immigration, with the changes that occur as, generations become settled within Canadian society, if you think of the first generation being the people who've come as adults to Canada from another country, and the 1.5 generation being people who came as children from another country, and the second generation being those who were born in Canada. I'm a third generation immigrant, so it puts me in a slightly different category. But for those first generations, there's a lot of cultural adaptation that takes place in order to sort out how you fit within the Canadian society and how it is that you're going to function within Canadian society. So whereas the first generation may choose to, maintain a lot of cultural customs, to be very strong in that identity and offer that as their offering to the Canadian multicultural scene, the 1.5 and second generation are sort of, in some ways, developing a hybrid identity where they have an experience of their parents' culture, but they're also becoming established among their friendship groups, within their schools, within their workplaces. And so sometimes that can be a little bit less tidy than what we depict with those, very firm set pieces in the mosaic. And so I think talking about a kaleidoscope, the children's toy where you put all the pieces into the tube with the mirrors and turn it in front of the light and it makes all these beautiful patterns that are constantly changing. I think that captures some of that cultural hybridity and also helps us think about the fact that this is an environment where there's a lot of change taking place on a regular basis. I think that's true for many Canadian communities as I've traveled across the country.
That's really helpful. That's good imagery for kind of picking up that nuance, I think. Now, one last piece that sort of defies expectations about your report, and that's that the report isn't the typical kind of church planting or missiological literature that we might expect to read. Could you tell us about how you approached sharing your research and the significance behind this particular approach?
Well, I've benefited over 2 decades now from being able to visit different churches, either new congregations, so church plants that are just starting, or as I've visited more established congregations that are trying to work out something around congregational change, refocusing their mission or developing new connections within their community. And I have really benefited from the very different expressions of Christian faith that my colleagues, my brothers and sisters in the faith have sort of allowed me to enter into, and I've had a chance to experience. And so with this particular research fellowship, I knew I would be working with a lot of data. We would be looking at what Canada Revenue Agency says, be comparing that to Statistics Canada, community information. We'd be doing surveys and sort of taking some time to analyze themes and data. But I spoke to the director and associate director and said, I really want to also have an embodied experience. Because for me and my work as a consultant and church planning coach, there's just so much that I learned from that opportunity to actually spend time. In this case, it's not a lot of time. I have done, single worship service visits with 30 new congregations in the region in which I live. And I knew that I didn't want to just report on the facts, how many people were there, what kinds of songs were sung. I wanted to try and invite readers into some of the experience, which isn't easy when you're looking at 30 congregations and trying to write a report that's short enough that people will read it. But trying to also offer some of the contrast in those experiences that captures some of the diversity of the region where I live.
James, one of the things that you observed is that location plays an important role in who a church or congregation reaches and what they do. Could you tell us a little bit about the important considerations of location when thinking about establishing worship communities in an urban city with a growing immigrant population?
Well, as you probably know, a lot of new congregations that starts with kind of a dream and some conversations. And so that can take place in, established church lobbies that are open to having sort of a new expression to engage in sort of a mission of multiplication. That can happen in people's living rooms or in coffee shops. But once a group reaches a size, if they have a vision of becoming sort of a worshiping community of a size larger than maybe a couple dozen, some of those spaces become very difficult. It's hard to find houses that have rooms that will accommodate a group that size. And so this looking for space to meet has become a bit of a quest for a lot of new congregations in Canada. Depending on what city you live in, there's different expectations or requirements or even predispositions towards having congregations meet. When I was doing the interview with denominational organizational leaders, some of them were lamenting that some of the cities that they were starting new congregations in just had difficulty finding any space where they could meet. And one of the other leaders said, oh yeah, there's a community center in that city where they charge them $20 an hour for rent. It's been highly economical for one of our new congregations. It varies greatly from community to community. What I've discovered in my own region is that some of the congregations possibly could meet anywhere. There's a strong reason for them gathering together. They're all sharing in a common language or culture from their country of origin. So it's more of a network church than a neighborhood church necessarily. But one of the congregations I visited, as I spoke with friends who were worshipers there, they said it made a big difference when they moved from outside of the city, sort of on the outskirts in between a couple of the towns in our region, right into the downtown. Because being on the light transit line made their worship service accessible to university students. And the minister is a very articulate speaker, would be invited to minister among university students. And so this would allow the university students to actually participate in this newly forming community. Other places, it seemed like, well, this is what we could get, right? Like this was a space that could accommodate us. I was surprised in the downtown to find two churches on the same Sunday morning meeting in the same hotel. So one was on the first floor conference room, one was on the second floor conference room. And obviously they've been able to work that out. The one had seemed to have been there for a period of time. The other was very new, was just sort of inviting people into what their congregation was doing in the community. The office space with COVID, with work from home policies, it seemed like there was some office spaces that were provided, allowance for congregations to meet. There's one former factory right in the downtown that's been transformed into sort of an urban chic post-industrial aesthetic with the exposed beams and all that, and found like both a young adult, I don't know if this is the right term, urban hipster kind of vibe, felt very contemporary, Canadian-born folks. And then down the hall, a congregation started by Nigerian missionaries to Canada that was largely people of African background. I've since learned that the one Canadian-born congregation, they had to move because the landlord was increasing the rent and was making some comments about, I believe the conversation had something to do with zoning, which I'm not sure. how that played out. I wasn't part of that conversation. I'm hearing it secondhand. But not all these spaces are stable for new congregations either.
So, James, this is really interesting. So, you talked a little bit about accessibility and location choice and how unstable some of these locations are. I have just a question. What about discoverability? You've got two in a hotel. Normally people drive past a hotel and they don't think, I'll go in there and I'll find one of the two churches that are in there. How are these congregations making themselves discoverable by people in their community?
Yeah, that's a great question. The ones that I visited, I didn't see much indication of doing sort of like big community events. And it may just be that the Sundays that I visited, that wasn't up for discussion. They weren't doing the plans or doing the debrief on those kinds of things. There was one that was meeting in a park just for the summer. And that seemed to be a way of just doing something different and being present out in the community in a different way. By and large, there seemed to be a great deal of investment in the online presence of their church as a way of letting people know how to find them. So at its most basic, the websites would have the name, a little bit about the church, and sort of directions and how to get there, with different degrees of specificity. The one had a very specific map, which was helpful because they're in the back room of an apartment building, with entrance off of one of the side parking lots. But that seems to be their predominant presence. And social media, having multiple social media sites, having some activity that they're putting out there on the social media, made them findable. And for me as a researcher, it's helpful because I could look at when they started their social media account and get a sense of, was this 10 years old or younger? So that seems to be the predominant way. There's a few that their location contributed to that. So two of the new congregations I visited were very focused on college students. The one was very multicultural and was attracting college students just because they were within walking distance from the local college. The other one was trying to address a very specific need of African international students at college who, have left support systems as they've come to get their schooling, and was actively providing a community via starting a new congregation in a community center gym that would be within walking distance. So for some, proximity did matter, but for a number of them, it seemed like their calling card was their online presence.
Now, James, you mentioned that some congregations look monocultural while others are more culturally diverse, and that's really just visually, but you cautioned readers about our unchecked assumptions when using these terms. So could you explain some precautions for understanding the cultural makeup of a given congregation?
So some of the congregations I went to, you look across the worshiping group there, and visibly, you can see there's people of different backgrounds here. The one congregation I visited, they were actually celebrating their All Nations Sunday, which they do every year, with about just over 70 congregants present that morning. They indicated they had like 19 different countries of origin that were part of their congregation. Amazing celebration where they actually got to, walk down the center of the church building that they were renting, be able to say something about their country and whatever. It was a really fun morning. Others, you look across the congregation and visibly things look very homogenous. And what I've discovered as I've done coaching and as I've worked with church planters of different backgrounds is that you do need to allow for getting to know individuals' backgrounds to understand how diversity plays out within that congregation. One of the Hispanic planters that I had as a guest speaker when I was in Fuller's Theological Seminary as a PhD student had started a church in Winnipeg and said, yes, like Spanish was the language of our congregation, but there's a lot of countries in South America. Mm-hmm. And we had many different cultural backgrounds, many different dialects. It affected our communication. Like certain words meant one thing in one Spanish dialect, and that same word meant something else in another dialect. He said, sometimes they have funny stories coming out of that. But to appreciate that on a one-time visit, I may not be getting the full picture of what the diversity is, but to appreciate that this is part of the story of each congregation. Especially congregations where a lot of the people have moved to Canada, the ways in which the next generation friends become incorporated into the congregation can paint a very different picture than what you might just observe from a one-time visit.
That's helpful. One of the, I think, assumptions just based on your title is that you encountered quite a bit of congregational diversity in your research. So for the purpose of this podcast, I wonder if you could just compare two of the congregations that you visited, and would you walk us through your experience as a visitor and talk us through your process as a researcher with these two examples, side by side, maybe?
Sure. One that was quite interesting was a congregation meeting in a community center, and it was only about 20 to 30 people there on that Sunday morning. They're very new. They just started in 2024, so they just started a few months earlier. And they had been sponsored by one of the neighboring cities. I talked to one woman who had this dream of having a congregation in the city that she lived rather than commuting to the neighboring city, and who had been praying for a long time and had people come around this vision. They were actually part of an international church planting movement. A week prior, I had, by accident, gone to one of the more established congregations within their movement. And I think it was a divinely appointed thing. I don't think it was an accident. And it certainly was beneficial to me in gaining perspective to show up on the 33rd anniversary of their Eastern Ontario movement within Canada. They were celebrating that they had over 30 churches in Canada in their 33 years of existing in Canada. They're a church planting movement out of the Philippines. They also took some time to explain their global vision. If I was to hazard a guess, they were sort of following migration patterns, but then telling people who are moving to new cities, we're going to make you a missionary. On screen, they had one person in an East Coast city where it was just the husband and wife were on camera, saying, hey, we're the couple that are going to lead things off in this city. So it seemed to have that kind of vibrancy. It was also remarkable. For the anniversary service, they did a lot of programming that was broadcast, and it was dramatically vibrant in terms of the number of arts made available. There's a young man who is doing a spoken word reading while there was dramatic and dance elements taking place. A lot of the worship had dance incorporated and flags. It wasn't quite that dramatic in just the community center, just started this year congregation, but you could see they were working at pulling things together, and had a guest speaker who was simultaneously translating between two languages. It was quite remarkable in how effective that was done in that setting. So that would be an example of a congregation where they have deep roots in the Christian faith in another country and really have mobilized themselves to say, hey, where you're going, you can start a church. One of the other congregations was a mainline denomination, but one that has an evangelical commitment. They had started 6 years prior, largely people who speak English as their background, largely people from that particular denominational tradition, and had started off in a Christian school, and then they were the ones that moved into the downtown. They're part of in a community center where previously it had been a Catholic high school, still had the scoreboard up in the corner of the gym. And there's about over 200 people gathered there that morning. In very broad terms, right, the liturgy was similar. You have welcome and you have worship and you have a message and then, sort of a closing, a response to the worship. But the elements within that were very different, and they reflected very different denominational traditions. I remember the minister at the downtown church plant at one point was realizing, had been preaching for 15 minutes and was still on the first slide. And so said, I know some of you have a roast on at home and you're thinking this preacher better land the plane soon because we need to get going. But he said, but if you were in a charismatic congregation and not our denomination, it could have a 1 hour sermon. I kind of had to, it was a joke, but I did kind of have to stifle my laugh a little bit because the previous week I'd been at the charismatic congregation that had the 1 hour sermon just down the street. But they both embraced their denominational tradition. They're very upfront. This is who we are. This is why we do our liturgy this way, but also very open, very warm. I talked to a couple, they had short break time as children were sent out. There's a lot of children at that congregation. Just talk to the person beside you. And so, you don't know how that's going to go in a congregation of over 200 people. Like, how do people interact with each other? Are they comfortable with that, or just talking to the person beside them? And in this case, lovely couple who'd moved to Canada from the States to work in the local universities. And we're just so happy to find such a warm, loving congregation that was sort of meeting the needs that they had. So I guess there is an immigration connection there in that congregation as well. They were also the ones that were connecting with a lot of university students, a number of whom were of international background. That would be sort of an example of where you have very much an international church planting movement making a contribution to Canada. And yes, like a local leader initiated within the region congregation, but one that is accessible, open to, is inviting some elements of the multicultural community to be part.
James, thank you so much for your time and this important work. I personally find this very encouraging to hear about all the different forms of church planting. And I think it's just so important for this to be out there in front of us as, who knows, the Holy Spirit may lay on our hearts to start a church, and this would give us some ideas about how we might do that and reach our communities. James, how can listeners access your report?
The Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research will have all of our reports posted on the website. So that's a place that you can go. And I assume that that's a link that you may be able to provide to the listeners on your site. So that's very much appreciated, by the way. Thank you for that.
James Watson, thank you for being on the Faith Trends podcast.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Lindsay, I'm just so struck in reading James's paper at how many new congregations are being planted right in a fairly tight metropolitan area in southwestern Ontario, and just all the very creative ways that they're finding places to meet in. It just makes me wonder, how many churches are there that fly under our radar simply because we don't discover them in the ways that we've typically thought of finding churches.
That's right. And in James's paper, he talks about how some congregations will very intentionally only reach out to a certain kind of demographic, whether it's international students on a particular campus, or if it's reaching first generation immigrants from a certain community. So I think sometimes they're okay with flying under the radar because they're not necessarily casting a wide net. I think there's different considerations that determine who a church is reaching for and who will discover it.
I live in Orleans, Ontario, and there's a muffler shop that has a basement underneath it, and there's a staircase at either end of the muffler shop. And as you go down the staircase on each end, there is a different church. So there's two churches under a muffler shop, but there's only a very small sign visible from the road that would let you know that there were churches down there. So somehow these churches are there and growing and thriving. It's just sort of flying under the radar. I met the pastor from one of these churches, and I believe it was a Redeemed Christian Church of God church, the Nigerian denomination that I think James was talking about. And, he was very apologetic that he had been open for a few years and only grown his church to 120 people, and how it seems like that was underperforming for Nigeria. But, he's doing remarkably well for a church plant in a Canadian context. I don't know whether most of us are even aware that the Redeemed Christian Church of God exists as a denomination in Canada, and yet they are one of the most vibrant evangelical movements in Canada today.
I wonder, this picture that John paints for us of heaven with every tribe, nation, and tongue worshiping together. What's the end game? Should we keep worshiping in these kind of separate, more enculturated communities, or should there be an effort to try to cooperate and learn to worship together? I see a very real need for these very direct and targeted expressions for worship and worshiping together. But how do we also move toward reflecting the kingdom come, the heavenly peace, where we get these not just multi-ethnic churches, but multicultural churches, where the actual culture of the church is reflective of the kaleidoscope that James was commenting on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the things is we can just become aware of the churches that are in our communities, in our neighborhoods. I discovered the churches under the muffler shop when I was out for a walk. Although I've met one of the pastors, I haven't attended a service yet, but sometimes it might be worthwhile visiting a church, not so that we can promote the circulation of the saints, but to have an appreciation of the communities that our brothers and sisters are in different parts of our own community. We all like to be in a place where we feel comfortable. I don't think that there's any special virtue about being made uncomfortable, but there is a virtue in recognizing the body of Christ outside of our congregations and appreciating what they bring to, our common kingdom mission.
Thanks for listening to this intentionally ad-free podcast. Find out more about the EFC's research and how you can support it with a donation at theefc.ca/research.